One of the most important issues that really underlies virtually all global health challenges is hunger and malnutrition. So in this session, we're going to talk about how we think about it, how we measure it. This is an interesting map from the World Food Program, which is part of the United Nations. You can see the colors of the percentage of people who are undernourished by country. And again, perhaps not surprisingly, sub-Saharan Africa has much higher levels of undernourishment, those dark red areas, but also orange and yellow, Asia, South Asia, parts of Latin America, where hunger continues to be a very real problem. Of course, in the United States, we also have hunger, not quite at the same levels of much of the developing world, but we have hunger all over the world. And this is just showing for under 5 mortality, right? So children dying at a young age, that malnutrition is thought to underlie about 54% of all that under 5 mortality is related to malnutrition. Malnutrition weakens people's immune systems. It makes children more vulnerable to a whole range of other conditions. There's 2 basic things that we look at with undernutrition or malnutrition. Protein energy malnutrition, or something called PEM, and that means that someone is not getting enough protein or energy, right? You need both those things. And then somewhat related is something we call micronutrient malnutrition. So we need protein, we need energy, but we also need a whole range of vitamins and phytonutrients in addition that have a whole range of functions. So when we have a poor diet quality, we might get lots of energy, right, if we eat lots of carbohydrates, but if we're not getting protein and micronutrients, we are going to become malnourished. How do we measure protein energy malnutrition? Well, the really most simple, basic way we do it, and this is often what's reported in mainstream media, weight, height, and age. So we have something called weight for age, which is a measure of underweightness. So if a child is 4.5 years old, are they low in weight for that age? Are they high in weight compared to what we call a reference population? And then weight for height, something we call wasting. And that means that a child, for their height, they look very skinny. So when someone's wasting, that's where you really notice that they look very skinny. Height for age or stunting. If a child is not growing well, sometimes when a child is undernourished, the body's physiology kind of compensates and tries to keep the child's body healthy otherwise, but not allowing it to grow as much. So sometimes you'll see children, especially in very, very poor communities and poor countries, that might look quite healthy, but you realize they're actually quite short for their age. We call that stunting, and that's a measure of chronic malnutrition. A Z-score. What we do is we take a reference population. That used to be a population, interestingly enough, that was primarily from the upper Midwest of the United States, places like Ohio. And they would take a group of kids and say, okay, here's a group of relatively well-nourished, healthy kids. How are they distributed in terms of, most people are sort of in the middle. There's some kids who are a little heavy on the right end of the bell curve and some that are less heavy on the left end of the bell curve. And that's the reference curve. Then we might look at a malnourished population and plot it against the reference. When we talk about a Z-score, what we mean by that is one Z-score is one standard deviation away from the median. So it's a way of measuring if people are way out on the left end of that curve, how many standard deviations away from the median are they? So we can look at a whole malnourished population, and you can see that that whole population, if they're plotted on this curve, are shifted way to the left. And then we say the standard in global health is if you're less than 2 standard deviations below the mean of the reference population, that means that you are most likely malnourished. So you can see that in this other population on the left, a majority of them would be considered malnourished. A majority of that population is below 2 Z-scores, and that's really bad. But that's how we measure malnutrition. We say, well, what would a healthy population look like? And then we measure the population we're interested in and see how do they measure up. And if they're way low like that, that means you've got a real malnutrition problem in your community. Stunting is also known as chronic malnutrition, and usually we find stunting when a community and the children in it have suffered ongoing lack of good nutrition. That could be lack of protein and energy and micronutrients. If children aren't getting enough iron and zinc and a whole range of other micronutrients, that can contribute to stunting, but you also need protein. So it's measuring it chronically over time, and that means if you were to visit that community and there's a lot of stunting, you may not notice that kids may not even look that malnourished because you don't realize that they're much shorter in stature than they ought to be for their ages. That's in contrast to something we call wasting or acute malnutrition, which is where usually over a shorter period where children have just not been getting enough protein or energy, and certainly if you're not getting those, you're probably not getting micronutrients, and they start to look very, very emaciated and skinny. And those are the very frightening images we often see in refugee camps and in humanitarian emergencies, or lots of kids suffering from acute or wasting malnutrition. Some specific conditions that you might hear about, especially in African context, but around the world, something called kwashiorkor, which is actually a West African word to describe when a child has generally been getting enough energy but not enough protein. And there's a certain set of symptoms, swelling, edema, and skin flaking that is a syndrome called kwashiorkor. Kwashiorkor is something that we often see in places that may not have, they're very poor, but they don't have a lot of conflict necessarily, or refugees. And we'll see kwashiorkor, for example, in communities we work with in Mozambique, that are really the result of mothers that don't have the resources to purchase protein. So they can't buy chickens or buy other sources of animal source protein or other types of food. They can only provide maybe a cornmeal mush for them, something we call sadza, which provides energy but doesn't provide the protein. So it's often a sign of deep poverty when children can get enough calories or close to enough calories but not enough protein. Marasmus is when a child is so malnourished and really starving that they become unbelievably emaciated in this very, very sad photo. And marasmus is what you often see in refugee situations, in conflict situations, in places where there's extreme lack of availability of and access to food over an extended period of time. Just some more data. Percentage of children under 5 who are stunted. Again, we see very dramatic differences around the world. Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have the highest rates of stunting. That means 40% of children in Sub-Saharan Africa are not getting enough food. Very importantly, there's a cycle of infection and malnutrition. This is just a depiction of the cycle of infection and malnutrition, a good way to sort of think about it. Malnourished children and adults, but especially young children, are much more vulnerable to infection. Once kids are infected, they are more likely to become malnourished. So both conditions influence each other in a very vicious downward spiral. So if a child has a fever could be a whole range of viruses that can cause that, or bacteria, they might have anorexia, so they don't eat while they have a fever, so they become malnourished while they're feverish and not being treated. Diarrheal disease, which is very, very common in poor countries with poor access to water, can lead to malabsorption of nutrients. So the diarrheal disease causes nutrients not to be absorbed, leading to more malnutrition, which means that the immune system is not functioning well, which leads to more diarrheal disease. You have that vicious cycle. There is a need when children are growing, especially in those first few years of life, they will fall off the growth curve. They lose weight rather than gaining weight, and they need to get catch-up growth. So they need extra food after they've had an infection that's reduced their growth. They need to get some extra food, and sometimes they can't get that. So over time, after repeated infections, their growth is going to be slowed down, and that's one of the reasons why you get stunting over time. Breastfeeding is vitally important for kids in very, very poor circumstances when they're exposed to infectious diseases. Breast milk is by far the best nutrition for infants, but in addition, mother's breast milk confers immunity and transfers some of the mother's immunity to the infant. So breast milk is actually very protective in that way as well. And where mothers are unable to breastfeed, that really heightens the risk of infection and of child mortality. So promotion of breastfeeding is vitally important. Weaning, where mothers start to give their infants or their small children solid foods and begin to reduce breastfeeding, is really the most dangerous period in most cases for young children in poor places. It means they're more exposed to infectious agents. Once they start getting a gut infection, that can lead to that perilous downward spiral of malnutrition and infection. So that cycle of infection and malnutrition is in many ways probably the single biggest cause of under 5 mortality. Low birth weight is a part of this picture. There are many causes of low birth weight. Sometimes it's just premature birth, but also malaria in the placenta or a mother who's malnourished. A child who's born low birth weight is also vulnerable to a whole range of other health problems as they grow up. So low birth weight is one of the dimensions of malnutrition. This is an example of what has been called the Road to Health card. And what it does is provides these are 3 segments, 3 years in a young child's life, starting hopefully when they're born. And the nurses in primary health care, postpartum care, the child comes in and in principle should be weighed really every month for at least 3 years. And then their growth is charted. And the 2 solid lines that sort of arc up are it's called the road to health. If the child is within those 2 lines, it's thought that they are growing in a healthy way. And the nurses are trained to do what's called growth monitoring. And as you see, there's 2 examples here. The top example with the dots kind of going up and down. The one on the top there is an example of a child who started out growing very healthily. They should have come in earlier. Notice that they start I believe that's the 7th month. In principle, you want them to come back for growth monitoring in the first couple months after birth. You can see that they start out growing strongly, but then they start to level off at the 9th month and actually goes down, goes up a little, goes down. That's a child that the trajectory is not real good there. So a nurse might want to intervene and try to understand what's happening. As they get older, they're still within the range of normal, but the trajectory is very important. It's kind of a danger sign. As you can see in the lower right of the card there, it's a good if it's going up, it's a danger sign if it's flat, and it's very dangerous if the weight is going down. That's probably a result of infection in many cases. The line below it is below the road to health, but at least it's on an upward trajectory. So there's monitoring that has to happen and promotion of good feeding and trying to make sure the mother has enough food, but at least the child is growing. So those are 2 examples of growth curves that are concerning. So in primary health care, in health posts all around the developing world, mothers are coming in, having their children weighed and monitored. And if there's a problem, the nurses will intervene either through special nutritional supplements in extreme cases or educational classes or identifying and treating an infection to hopefully help the child grow. So what do we do in primary healthcare systems? So the images on the right are this kind of growth monitoring weighing. You see this if you spent time in health posts all around Africa, you will have seen something like this. Promotion of breastfeeding is vital. Growth monitoring over those 3 years, sometimes longer. Provision of education, but also sometimes weaning foods. When women come in, they get to have access to some weaning foods to help them and to help learn about what are the best weaning foods. Nutrition education, supplementary feeding with screening as necessary. If a child is really doing badly, they might even be hospitalized with supplementary feeding. Provision of vitamin A supplements. Turns out that vitamin A is very important to the immune system. And so in places where there's really serious vitamin A deficiencies, just providing a supplement in the form of a pill to children can have a huge impact on their immune system. Provision of iron tablets and iodine to make sure that those micronutrients are included. So micronutrients is part of the nutrition picture. So vitamin A deficiency, we mentioned that already, can lead to eye problems, xerophthalmia, but also a weakened immune system. Iodine in the salt to prevent goiter, which you've probably heard about. And then iron tablets are really important to prevent anemia, for energy levels, development. It's thought that iron plays a really important role in cognitive development as well. So providing these kinds of things in primary health care is thought to be helpful. There are other micronutrients, zinc, thiamine, niacin, a large variety of other vitamins and phytonutrients that really come primarily through diet quality, right? So animal source protein, chicken is very common throughout the world, but also fish, rabbits, in addition to things like goats and beef. Fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables, vitally important, but both those things cost lots of money. So that's one reason why in some places people can get enough energy. It might be some kind of flour, some kind of carbohydrate, but they can't get good protein in fruits and vegetables. And then there's these artificial supplements in primary health care that are relatively inexpensive, vitamin A and iron, that are routinely provided. This is just an indication that when we think about malnutrition, there's issues of dietary intake, there's issues of disease, those interact with each other. But going one step up the chain, inadequate access to food, inadequate care for women and children, insufficient health services, and unhealthy environment. But then you got to go one step up and say, okay, resources and control. Who controls land? Who controls markets? Who controls food? Why is it that some people are hungry and others are not? Right? So food and food security is a very complicated picture. Malnutrition isn't simply about health education and weaning foods and behaviors of the poorest people. It's really about what are the circumstances that have led to poor people not having access to enough food and good diet. So hunger and famines, we've seen them all around the world for all of human history. They appear often as a result of conflict, of drought, but very importantly also because of political struggles and inequality. The older drawing there is a depiction of the famine in Ireland, the potato famine, which is thought to have killed several million people, was a result of British policy and oppression of the Irish population. So famines are complicated, and it's important to sort of understand those. They tell us a lot about where hunger comes from. I want to just highlight sort of an idea that comes from somebody named Thomas Malthus. When we talk about Malthusians, they come from people who adhere to Thomas Malthus's theory. He put out there that the idea, the Malthusian theory, was that biological populations, which include human populations, grow faster than their food supply, and therefore hunger and even famines are the result of high population growth and running out of enough food for everybody. This is what's called Malthusianism. We are going to suggest that that is generally not actually the way things work. And this idea has led to this notion that overpopulation is so threatening to food. Famines have occurred because of overpopulation or exceeding the carrying capacity. This approach, if you read through this quote, is what we want to suggest in this class is actually not correct. Famine is not typically induced by a human population exceeding the carrying capacity. We're going to talk about why that's the case, that most famines have other causes. So if we take the population growth problem and food availability as the reason why there are famines and hunger, that means that what you're going to do is, to solve it, is you're going to emphasize food supply, and we're going to measure food supply per capita as our way of understanding whether people are food insecure or not. There's something called food availability decline, called FAD, as a cause of hunger and famines. Food availability decline can result from natural disasters, overpopulation, and war. Now, you might think, well, that seems like an obvious thing. However, the implications are that the way we deal with hunger and famine is by providing tons of food relief, providing charity, focusing on population control, focusing on producing high-yield crops. The real problem of famine and hunger is that people aren't growing good crops, and there's just not enough food around for everybody. But enter one of our heroes who really studied this problem and found out that all those assumptions are actually generally not true. And this is Amartya Sen, who is originally from India. He is an economist and splits his appointment between Harvard and Oxford, but he won the Nobel Prize in the 1990s for his work on poverty and famines, and he changed the way we think about this. He analyzed this from an economist point of view. And we're going to talk a little bit about his ideas. He studied famines in places like Bengal and Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and the Sahel in Africa. And what he found is that in many of these cases, food availability per capita actually increased in some instances during these famines, that famine was not a result of not enough food in those countries. He said it's actually about entitlements. A person is reduced to starvation if some change, either in his endowment, alienation of land or loss of labor power due to ill health, or in his exchange entitlement mapping, a fall in wages, rise in food prices, loss of employment, drop in the price of goods, makes it no longer possible for him to acquire any commodity bundle with enough food. So that's kind of complicated economist speech for the basic idea that people become hungry and even starve because they don't have access to something that allows them to get food. They don't have wages, they don't have a job, they don't have land. Something's been taken away from them that would allow them to get food. Even when there's food around, they can't get it because they can't buy it. Entitlements can be production-based, access to land to produce your own food. Employment-based, that provides income to go and buy food. Might be trade-based. Some countries have more barter, where you're trading something you're making for some food. Or transfer-based, which can be a government gives you a food coupon or a food stamp that you can go to a supermarket and get food. This is what he's calling entitlements. You have something that the society provides you that allows you to get the food you need. It's just an image from, you can imagine, from the 1930s during the Depression in the United States. And it's an interesting depiction of hunger, right? These are all unemployed men who have lost their wages, and they have no way to get food other than to line up at a soup, what we used to call soup kitchens. They're getting free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed, and it's free. So this is a real depiction of an informal kind of entitlement here in the society before we had unemployment insurance and Social Security, where if you lost your job, you have no way to get food to eat other than the charity of somebody setting up a free soup kitchen. So in this idea, there's real emphasis on social inequality. Hunger and famine are consequences of entitlement failure, right? In other words, people lose their jobs or their land. Hunger and famine afflict the most vulnerable, people who can be fired easily and lose their jobs. Vulnerability is produced by social inequality, legally encoded in ownership, rules, and rights. And social inequality, of course, is the product of inequalities in power. Some people get to have stuff, some people don't. As such, in the end, hunger and famine are the products of social systems, political, economic, and even cultural, not really natural disasters, desertification, pestilence, or overpopulation. The issue is, how is the society organized in order to provide people who might be afflicted by a natural disaster or pestilence or overpopulation? So when we have a natural disaster like the recent hurricane in Houston in the United States, that did not really create huge amounts of hunger because we have a social system that ensured that most of the victims got access to something. But in poor countries, they'll have social systems where people are not provided for. And so you might find hunger, for example, from typhoons in Bangladesh. That led to a new conception of what we think of as food security, not just malnutrition, but food security. And it's defined now by secure access to enough food at all times. A very powerful short phrase. You have to have secure access. It has to be sufficient amount of food all the time. It doesn't vary by whether you're unemployed or employed, or whether the crops in one season are bad and periodicity of production and food crops. It has to be sufficient in calories and diet quality. There needs to be guaranteed access. Even if you lose your job, you lose your land, you lose everything, you have a right to get the food you need to survive for you and your family. Security, there's risk and vulnerability are mitigated by having a system which ensures that everyone at risk actually will get something. And it has to be guaranteed over time, transitory versus chronic insecurity. Some societies where you have ups and downs in the production calendar and the harvest calendar, there might be periods where people have less food. Well, there should be a system set up to make sure everyone has food all the time. So there can be shocks to food security, right? And this is the way we think about it now, influenced by Amartya Sen. This is the way the World Food Program is thinking about food security, even the FDA in the United States. Work shocks, unemployment, people lose their jobs or their wages decline for a variety of reasons, even as a result of inflation. That can lead to food insecurity. Output shocks, drought, and land expropriation can lead to a food security shock. The definition of food shocks is the decline in availability leads to price increases. Diet quality and quantity are affected. Asset shocks, if you lose your house and all your belongings in a hurricane or a typhoon or a wildfire, you are at risk. There's a new thing related to HIV, relatively new, we call age shock, in which people of productive age die or are very sick from HIV infection. They're no longer to earn income, no longer able to produce food, no longer able to take care of their families. That can produce food security shock. What are the policy implications? Well, we can begin to predict hunger and famines not on the basis of weather patterns, but on the basis of social systems, right? In places where there are no social systems and where there's high inequality and many people unemployed, we can predict that there will be hunger and famines. Things like neoliberalism and structural adjustment might impact vulnerability because structural adjustment cuts government safety net programs for the poor. Amartya Sen said, democracy is actually the best way to prevent food insecurity. And he argued that authoritarian regimes are more prone to famines than democratic ones. In truly democratic societies, because everyone has a say, there'll be less inequality and more distribution of power, and people will ensure that everyone has access to food and that social systems are set up so people have access and have a right to good quality diet all the time. So democracy at that upstream level, social determinant level, is very important to preventing food insecurity and making sure that there's good nutrition for all. So food security and nutrition, a huge underlying foundation of so many of the other health problems that we face in global health. Very important to pay attention to that. Not just nutritionists, but food security experts are a very important part of our global health landscape.